And what you see happening in Australia, and I sort of made reference to it here, that you've got a very academic curriculum that's still very biased to is very Eurocentric, even though there's Australian and Asian flourishes to some extent. But it's a curriculum that's not really constructed based upon other ways of knowing. It's very much dominated by a Eurocentric view that you'll come to these schools and we will enculturate you, in a sense, change you into our Eurocentric issue. There's still a feeling of empire, but it is certainly a westernized empire. But right now in Australia, and for some time, you're starting to see an enormous amount of economic pressure on universities because governments do not necessarily want to pay the full cost of universities. And so the Australian universities and schools are looking for ways to raise funds. And they can do that with a few choices. And this is, I think, a global trend. Some people would sort of say it's sort of tied to a sort of a neoliberal sentiment. But you see in Australia now, in terms of the students, you'll see a mix of European and Asian students, but a growing interest in recruiting international students. And the reason for that, particularly at the at the undergraduate and graduate level, is basically economic, because universities all over the world have shifted from being government funded to being government supported, where the amount of government support for universities has dwindled over time. And so these economic pressure to internationalize is so interesting. It's recruiting international students, but where their experience is still very academically oriented towards a sort of a British system. And so in Australia, unlike some of the, let's say, Swedish universities or Chinese universities, where other languages might be allowed, it's English only. And we're a part of the transition to the university for some of the students is first passing a test to assess whether they have the competence in English. The same thing that's occurring with this, and this is an international trend, is a combination. I've already sort of talked about the internationalization, which is largely for, I think, financial return. What you're also seeing occurring is a nationalization of curriculum and of schooling. Historically, education in all parts of the world, and still is the case in Canada, at least to some extent, was very much a locally controlled enterprise, in a sense quite organic, as education was intended to sort of support the community. As education has moved, and particularly when it moved to academic, I think it became a little untethered from that. But what also has happened in this sort of neoliberal world is sort of a movement from state-controlled or provincial-controlled education, as it might be in Canada, to nationally controlled education. Not so much in Canada, but certainly you see it in Australia, in the UK, and in the US, that concept of the Common Core and the national testing. And so what we sort of see happening here is a sort of an interesting sort of development. It's gone from a very local orientation to a national and international. And indeed, increasingly, countries all over the world aren't just comparing what's actually happening across communities within their state or within their province and within their nation, they're now increasingly comparing themselves with other countries. And so you sort of see this growth of this sort of global auditing of social systems, including education, in an effort to sort of provide benchmarks for different countries, which serve as, I think, sort of a form of competition that gets started by which countries can assess to what extent they're doing well in education, that they may need to invest more in education, and so on. And so as you look at, again, the education sector, you start to sort of see the complexities of what we're talking about relative to global. It's not just an interest in international stuff. It's not just a sort of a flow of ideas. But with this is issues of governance, issues of history, and particularly in Australia's case, the influence of the British Empire. Interestingly, what I've described in Australia, if you went to some of the colonies, for example, Botswana, if you go to Botswana, you'll see the same phenomenon that I've seen. An interesting British curriculum, which is very academic, which is detached from the local. And so as we move into talking about these global issues, one finds oneself sort of asking the question, wow, wasn't this a form of colonization of education by the empire, which basically not only had to do with assimilation of Aboriginal people, but the whole world to a sort of in one sense, a British or a Western view. And as we sort of look at the complexities of globalization, I think what will become very apparent to you is we have that occurring as a major trend. And I'll try to explain to you or argue that it can be sort of connected to some of the developments that I'll also be talking about. But that certainly relates to sort of looking across time at what's gone on in public education or education in the K-12 and higher education area. Let me move from this then to taking a broad look at some sort of bigger global trends before I get into talking about the knowledge economy.